Today, on the 1325th day of the full-scale war, I want to talk about the Minsk Accords, an agreement drafted after the first part of the war, and about lessons that we can get from this failure. It is not a secret that wars end with some kind of arrangement, be it a comprehensive peace agreement or a ceasefire, but it is crucial for this agreement to be worded in an effective way. And yet, in many cases now, we see a rush to make a deal instead of aiming for the peace to really last. Case in point. A failed agreement is not just one of unsuccessful attempts at peace. If such a deal is struck in a bad faith and benefits the side of the aggressor, it gives way for potential further aggression while allowing a perception of safety for the international community. And this is a photo of the Nord Stream first launch, but because the second one didn't receive such colorful footage, but I suppose that's how it felt in Russia in the second time too. And moreover, when the deal fails, it erodes what little trust could have been left between the sides, and it's much harder to make a peace agreement next time. My argument today is simple. The Minsk Accords was doomed from the start because the document was drafted in an imperial manner. It ignored the true nature of Russia's aggression. It treated Ukraine as a buffer zone rather than a sovereign actor, and it rewarded the aggressor instead of deterring further violence. If we want to think about moving beyond empires, then Minsk Accords is a case study of how not to negotiate peace with a revisionist imperial power. Nowadays, Mr. Putin mentions quite frequently what can be translated as the root causes for the war. And while he means something entirely different from what I'm about to say, it is still crucial for the document to address the real causes. When it comes to the Minsk Accords, those root causes weren't acknowledged at all. Now, unlike many respectable scholars of the realist school suggest, these causes did not involve the NATO enlargement. And I feel like this debate is important to mention. Why is Professor John Mearsheimer wrong, as I see it? Well, there is a pattern to Russian aggression that is not always linked to NATO, but instead to a wish of a state from Russia's perceived sphere of influence to be truly independent and sovereign. Moreover, the alliance, if anything, demonstrates reluctance when it comes to admitting new members. And the bids come from bottom to top, from states who are scared of their neighbor, not vice versa. So the NATO enhancement theory completely denies states their agency. And let's not forget that somehow Russia completely ignored, in the military sense, the newly acquired kilometers of border with NATO in 2023. Russia doesn't have troops there at the northern border because it knows the simple truth that NATO has never waged war on Russia. If anything, the member states consistently downplay and ignore any casus belli that Russia gives them. Coming back to the pattern in Russia's aggression, it is noticeable that the Kremlin moves against any entity that tries to leave Russia's control. The case of Chechnya, or Republic of Ichkeria, might be a debatable case due to terroristic measures that were taken by the proponents of independence, which gave the federal forces some excuse to move. However, the Moldovan people declared their independence peacefully. And I'm not talking about the Transnistrian independence, but Moldovan independence from the USSR. And yet, Igor Girkin, the same man who, by his own accords, was responsible for the ignition of the conflict in Ukraine in 2014, and who is charged now with shooting the Malaysian Boeing, had been involved in Transnistrian conflict because the region represents what is called the Novorossiya. here. It translates as New Russia, and it's an imperial project inspired by Dugin and Malafeyev. Georgia is another interesting case. As Dr. Ruprecht said, Russia exploits existing conflicts to its benefits. And in this vein, Russia used the pre-existing local ethnic differences in the region after the Rose Revolution and the Georgia's bid for NATO in 2008. What's more, in this case, Russia supported the separatist movements of ethnic minorities who were actually allies of Chechen separatists, and Shamil Basayev himself, a terrorist responsible for multiple attacks on Russian soil. But for the Kremlin, it's not the matter of a belief in a cause that some nation has a right to have a territory, a state. And it's not a matter of ideology. What really matters is keeping neighbors in check, in control. And in all the years of occupation of Georgia, the first time that Mr. Lavrov suggested withdrawing Russian troops from Abkhazia and South Ossetia was in 2024, after the pro-Russian Georgian party, Georgian Dream, declared its victory. Similarly, Russian rhetoric concerning the sovereignty of Ukraine changed precisely with the political inclination of the country. After the Orange Revolution and the bid for NATO, Russian officials made their first threats. Then, once Yanukovych came in office, whose inclinations lied again with the alliance with Moscow, the aggressive rhetoric stopped. And it stopped to the point that the infamous propagandist Vladimir Solovyov in 2013 made claims about Crimea that people now go to jail for. For instance, he was asked by the audience whether Crimea should be taken, should be ours. And he said, God forbid, and asked the lady just how many Ukrainian and Russian lives she was willing to sacrifice for the cause. And yet, just months later, it somehow was clear to Solovyov. Russia readopted its aggressive rhetoric and deeds after Euromaidan and after the Ukrainian people declared their wish to be a part of the European Union. So, when it comes to wars Russia wages on its neighbors, Mr. Putin can talk all he wants about Pechenegi or Polovtsi, but as a matter of fact, neither history nor language nor geography truly matters. What matters is control and an imperial attachment to the idea of sphere of influence. Coming back to peace agreements. One way to draft a peace agreement so it might be effective is to ensure a total defeat of one side. As morally devastating as it would have been if Ukraine had been stripped of its sovereignty completely and got a puppet Lukashenko-like government, there would not have been a need for another agreement, at least not with Ukraine, maybe with Poland though, or Lithuania. But the Minsk Accords did not give the Kremlin the satisfaction and the pleasure. Ukraine kept its political freedom, its military capability, and even de jure it kept its territories. However, neither it gave Ukraine sufficient guarantees of sovereign existence, which would include protection of its right to decide the political path. What it did was establish an OSCE mission of unarmed observers who observed quite a number of violations of ceasefire during the years, and yet didn't have a mandate or resources to punish the violations and to make the sides observe the provisions of the treaty. There is also an issue that Richard Ned Lebo calls self-deterrence, the reluctance of actors to assume the risks of war independently of efforts by others to deter them. In other words, the Western countries did not demonstrate any resolve to defend their values, the international norms, or their own citizens and businesses who are operating on the Ukrainian soil. One of the cases in point is Crimea. In fact, it's rather astonishing that Crimea is never mentioned in the document. There is neither punishment for the invasion, nor there are mechanisms of deoccupation, any pathways to peace. More so, there are no concessions for Russia whatsoever. There are zero conditions on Russia itself in the document, nor there is addressing of the issue of Russia's involvement in the civil conflict. Meanwhile, the conditions imposed on Ukraine had a timing that benefited Russia. For instance, Mikhail Soldatenko argues that under provisions of Minsk, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions were supposed to be demilitarized only after they were granted autonomy by the Rada and after the elections were held. As a result, Russia was free to continue supplying weapons to its proxies until Kyiv implemented all of Moscow's conditions. After the Minsk I and II, Putin was left with de facto controlled Crimea, parts of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, while all the consequences that he faced were bearable economic sanctions. Lastly, there is an issue of levels in peace negotiations. Even though agreements are negotiated by appointed representatives, which constitutes level 1, the terms of the deal need support from the larger groups, from groups of government, people, interest groups, which is level 2. And of course, this second level is especially important for democracies because people actually have some power there. And it constitutes another disparity in the terms of the agreement, because while Putin didn't have to answer to the Russian people at all, the Minsk Accords resulted in ruling Poroshenko out of office. The Ukrainian public strongly opposed the provisions of autonomy for the regions, the idea of elections with de facto Russian troops occupying the regions, and the amnesty for separatists. So I believe that in some cases, the failure of an agreement may be foreseen by the negotiators as they draft the document. And for instance, Minsk Accords seem to have been designed in an ineffective way from the start, if not in a harmful way. First and foremost, the agreement ignored the cause of the conflict, the imperialistic sentiments of Moscow. It failed to counter it, treated Ukraine as a buffer zone, and failed to solve the territorial problem. Thus, paved the way to the second iteration. And now, on the 1325th day of the full-scale war, I ask myself whether history will repeat itself, whether urgency will outweigh efficiency, whether the aggressor will be encouraged yet again. Thank you.